Pantages, Chapter 3, Klondike Kate, Part 2. In Seattle in 1902, a few months after Pantages opened his fruit store, he purchased a short-form vaudeville and motion picture house of his own, opening his first Seattle theater, the Crystal Theater, in a narrow storefront, and presented mixed shows of a variety of live acts, and which became the seed of his vaudeville circuit. The Crystal Theater enjoyed considerable success, and Pantages quickly became an important figure in Seattle's vaudeville scene. The Crystal Theater offered both movies and vaudeville. This combination was already a well-established tradition by the time Pantages started the Crystal. What he contributed to vaudeville was a tenacious work ethic and a rapacious outmaneuvering of other vaudeville operators for popular acts. While ostensibly honest, he was not above withholding promised pay to his vaudeville actors and refusing to uphold his agreements to acts. What he had in the Crystal was an 18 by 75 foot space, a little more than a shelf, he would say, that he packed with benches, a projector, and a flimsy screen. Then he rented some films and showed movies alongside vaudeville acts, performing all the work himself. Often, there was no actual performance schedule, just what he determined his customers would watch. A stage act could be chopped in half, while a film was sped up, at a time when hand-cranked projectors offered no mechanism to regulate speed. Film scenes, consequently, were hard to recognize. Audience turnover was all that mattered. It was the first 10, 20, 30 cent vaudeville house in America. Pantages saw from his first theater that his profits depended on turnover, so he squeezed as many shows as he could, often between 15 and 20 per day. He also kept costs low and ran the operation almost entirely by himself, putting himself in multiple roles in the 200-seat theater. He was his own manager, booking agent, ticket taker, and janitor, performing all the work himself, from running the projector to his special expertise, sweeping the floor. Encouraged, Alexander invested in a low-class burlesque called The Strand in the Skid Row district, while Klondike Kate played in Fort Worth and Galveston, Texas, which were enjoying a black gold rush. Many months later, Kate returned to work at the Crystal with a new specialty, the butterfly dance. Pantages' attorney, Leroy Tozier, later congratulated Pantages on winning back Kate, as she was a financial asset. In a letter he wrote to Pantages, "Sincerely, I do trust no one should ever dim the horizon that now shines in resplendent adoration in the mind's eye of your Catherine. Most appropriate was your conduct in going with her to the Far East, been carrying her safely back to the northern wilds that she might replenish the treasury." Yet as suddenly as it began, by 1902, the relationship was suffering. Kate and Pantages were apart for long periods between 1902 and 1905. Although Pantages took her back, the damage was done. Then, ever restless, always in search of greener pastures, Klondike Kate was off again to more lucrative bookings in the Pacific Northwest, while Pantages negotiated for another theater. At this point, Klondike Kate apparently reunited with Pantages, but performed at the Alcazar because he could not afford her high salary. Pantages remarked, "People thought I was a Klondike millionaire. I didn't argue with them. I bought the picture house and spent $35,000 turning it into a beautiful place. I did it all on credit," he later recalled. "Before long we were putting on 12 to 15 shows a day and jammed them in." By the time Pantages arrived in 1902, variety and vaudeville had become popular, well-established forms of commercial theater. For a time, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, vaudeville enjoyed pride of place as a public popular entertainment. For an admission price of 10 cents, theater-goers could enjoy an hour's live entertainment. Pantages sunk everything he had and sought investors for a tacky storefront on 2nd Avenue in Seattle, which he named the Crystal Theater. This year, Pantages' meteoric rise in the motion picture exhibition business began. It was his innate business sense that enabled him to beat the odds. He could not have foreseen the growth of movies, but without the hard work and commitment he brought to the enterprise, he could have not grown his empire. Hard work is not unique to immigrants, but in Pantages' case, it became an emblem of his life. He could not compete with other exhibitors on the basis of his business connections, or financial backing, or social standing. He spoke in broken, accented English, and did not read or write English. What he lacked in sophistication, he made up in sheer doggedness and determination. Movies had, by 1900, become chasers at the end of vaudeville acts, signaling it was time for the audiences to clear the theaters. Some saloons also showcased films, an earlier version of the sports bar as novelties to attract drinking customers, but darkness and spilled drinks brought more problems than it was worth. It was up to theater owners like Pantages to rescue movies from cultural oblivion, which they did beginning in 1902. Immigrant and working-class families flocked to his operation, where the main feature was the show and not the ethnic background of its operator. That came much later, when films attracted tens of millions of audience members each week and concern arose of movies' undue influence on the minds of audiences, particularly the young. Class divisions began to widen and grow more pronounced, which resulted in competing aims for upper, middle, and lower-class citizens. The rapid pace at which industrialization unfolded during the 1880s began to alienate working-class wage earners who sought to preserve a sense of decency and honor in their work. In some communities, this goal was respected, but many found that as society focused increasingly on financial success, old customs, traditions, and morality dissolved. In areas where business elites were absent or had a singular focus on economic exploitation, laborers were seen as a dangerous revolutionary class and marginalized, which in turn encouraged workers to attack their oppressors. The massive inequality between workers and owners was roundly perceived as unjust and undermined traditional beliefs that business success was somehow the result of moral virtue on the part of a company's owner. Workers took increasing pride in their output and thought of themselves as honorable producers, contrasting their labor with that of lawyers, bankers, and brokers, who all got rich by manipulating others' money. Belief in a traditional understanding of the Protestant ethic that held a man's character to be responsible for his economic success was no longer possible following the Depression of 1893, when it became clear that many workers were poor through no fault of their own. Pantages was not unique as a cutthroat business operator, but the manner in which he cheated his actors out of their due, or outwitted his competition, showed that his itinerant years as a laborer, ditch digger, waiter, and finally theater owner in the frozen North have left their hardened marks on his steely soul. He was not a man to trifle with. He was also determined to succeed. The Crystal Theater did well from the start, and Pantages milked every penny from it. By then his relationship to Klondike Kate was nearing its end. At the time Pantages started the Crystal, he was just a struggling entrepreneur living by his wits. He kept in contact with Klondike Kate and was even funded by her money, but he was in the venture completely on his own. Few at the time could have foreseen Pantages' explosive rise as a theater owner, fewer still that movies would become so culturally dominant. His Crystal Theater, which offered both movies and vaudeville, his combination was already a well-established tradition by the time Pantages started his theater. What he contributed to vaudeville was a tenacious work ethic and a rapacious outmaneuvering of other vaudeville operators for popular acts. While ostensibly honest, Pantages was not above withholding promised pay to his vaudeville actors and refusing to uphold his agreements to acts. 21st century observers of the material performed by vaudeville comedians operating under the decency standards of their time may note that it appears hackneyed or simplistically slapstick. However, within the confines of 19th and early 20th century American society, their acts actually represented more language play than the sexually suggestive content performed by circus and burlesque comics of the era. Other performers found ways to perform risque material by manipulating popular perceptions of beauty and sexuality. Throughout her career, famed vaudeville singer Sophie Tucker used sexually provocative songs in her act. Yet because of her heavy-set and unattractive appearance, she was not interpreted as an object of sexual desire and did not run afoul of censors. Tucker herself noted several factors that allowed her to seemingly float contemporary standards. She would say, "Often I am asked, why do you sing hot songs? And I can answer truthfully. I've never sung a single song in my whole life on purpose to shock anyone. I sing to entertain. My hot numbers, and especially the songs Jack Yellen has been writing for me the past 20 years, are all, if you will notice, written around something that is real in the lives of millions of people. They are songs that mean something to everybody who hears them. Another thing about my hot numbers, they are all moral. They have to do with sex, but not with vice. That, I believe, is one secret of their unfailing popularity with American audiences. The other secret that makes for their success is the fact that they are all written in the first person. When I'm singing them, I am talking about myself. This makes me do them better than I could do a song about some indefinite third party. And the audience likes them better that way. The audience found my distress funny." In 1902, the Klondike Gold Rush was already dying out, and Klondike Kate headed south, first to British Columbia, where she set up a storefront movie theater. In Pantages' letters to her, during the winter of 1902 into 1903, Pantages still appeared deeply in love. Dictating to friends or trusted employees because he was illiterate, although he did just become a naturalized citizen, he wrote letters and begged Kate to write more often, and also expressed frustration with her growing romance with alcohol. Just before the Christmas in 1902, he wrote, "I fully expected to receive a letter from you today. I didn't, and I can say I felt hurt. Katie, I wonder if you will this time sincerely keep your promise and not drink anymore. I can assure you, Kate, I am sincerely sorry for what happened the other day. But I assure you, Katie, it's your own fault as you provoked me to it. As you know full well my disposition, and you should not have done it. I think the only way to keep you away from the booze is to have you with me. Warm with love, yours sincerely, Alex." Kate's response did not survive the years, but apparently Pantages' mounting business worries and the strain of trying to finance his theater chain were lost on her. When Kate finally did come south, it was to play in Victoria. Then she returned to Dawson. Kate was apparently focused on the Nickelodeon in Victoria she had purchased in 1902 for $350. Pantages, who was battling to raise enough credit to open the Crystal, was angered by her investment. He insisted she was throwing money away, but shared films and vaudeville bookings with her. When her Nickelodeon began to make a profit, she sold it for $1,500, returning to star billing in Dawson, where she could make better money. In that year, Trump married his wife, Christ, on August 26th, and moved to New York City, where Trump found work as a barber and a restaurant hotel manager. They lived in the Bronx. In later years, Klondike Kate would claim it was Pantages who deserted her, but during this period, it appears he worked hard to keep their love alive. On March 4th, 1903, in a letter to her, he wrote, "It is needless for me to say that I miss you. More, in fact, to speak the truth. More than any time during our past relationships. I have begun to realize that you are speeding on your way, separating ourselves from each other by many wiles. I can assure you, my dear, I shall ever think of you, as I know you will me, and always hold you as dear to me as if any time during our life. Write to me often, and let me know how you are progressing. Always think of Papa, and kiss me in your dreams. I shall ofttimes think of your dear face, wishing I might kiss it to satisfy my desire." By the following summer, Pantages seemed resigned. In another letter he wrote, "Even though we are parked many thousands of miles apart, my thoughts are ever with you. I'm eager to know who your correspondent is in Seattle that reports to you as to my movements. Yes, my dear, it is true, I'm getting fat as a pig. You see, I have no one to fight and fuss with, and I'm only waiting until your return so as to scrap in order to reduce my weight. Business is quite good with me, but still always bear in mind that Papa is always in need of ready cash and ever willing to put your savings alongside of his so as to make a good showing." 1904 saw the machinist strike for the Santa Fe Railroad, adopt increasingly militant tactics, building a 40-foot observation tower to peer over the tall wooden fences, ringing the railway yards to watch those workers who refused to go on strike, ultimately beating them in the street once they had left the yard. It wasn't until 1904 that Klondike Kate finally quit the Yukon, giving her forwarding address and that of Lotus Rockwell as the Alcazar Theater in Seattle. The best guess is that Lotus was the child Kate claimed to have adopted. Although she often declared her life an open book, Kate dismissed the subject in just 5 sentences. Quote, "I took the baby, I kept him until he was 3, then I found him home and foster parents in the States," she wrote in 1944. "I sent the money for his college education, and he is one of the most successful engineers in the country today. I have never disclosed his identity. He perhaps has never known of me, but I like to think of him as my son." While Pantages may have dreamt of a great theatrical empire, it is not clear that he had a strategic plan to expand his operations into a chain. The Crystal did well enough so that by 1904, Pantages was able to build the first house to carry the name Pantages Theater. It was bigger than the Crystal, 700 seats versus 400, and by 1907 featured an orchestra area and a balcony. Admission, however, still remained 10 cents. While that was twice what many Nickelodeon movie theaters charged at the time, a dime admission was considered a good entertainment value for seeing live performances. The Crystal was both an experiment and a testing ground for its owner. The Pantages, on the other hand, was a fully operational theater from the start and was designed to entertain Seattle's burgeoning audiences. It was also built to last, which it did until it was demolished in 1965. A typical billing comprised several acts, not uncommonly as many as 10, most often 7, and might feature musical performers, gymnasts, comic monologues or skits, and a mixture of other acts. Pantages' particular genius seems to have lain in his appreciation of which acts, or parts of acts, his audiences would enjoy. He exercised personal supervision over all bookings. Pantages' personal involvement with all aspects of his theatrical businesses seems to have been essential to his creation of a theatrical empire. He possessed, however, the prodigious memory of the unlettered, and a shrewd ability to compensate for these deficiencies in his business and theatrical dealings. More than anything, Pantages possessed the energetic ambition of the entrepreneur and a capacity to act quickly and decisively. He reveled in his attention and focus on the customer, long before it became a business religion in our digital age. While his competitors and other owners relied on the word of New York booking agents, or those apparently in the know as to which acts to hire, Pantages often sought out and judged performers himself, insisting on personally watching a potential act in front of a real audience to determine how well they were received. He had little time for reputations or fame. If his customers were not moved or laughed or enjoyed the show, a star's following meant nothing to him. The acts of the Pantages circuit distinguished themselves from their rivals by the quality of performers and by a tendency to be sensational. Like the Crystal, the Pantages Theater was profitable. There were other prominent theater impresarios to contend with, but Pantages held his own. His circuit faced vigorous competition. However, as the vaudeville theater business was anything but monolithic. Rival circuits, like those of another impresario, John Considine and John Court, enjoyed a considerable following in Seattle as in other cities, and vied for performers as well as for patrons. After Pantages opened his second theater in downtown Seattle, then a fierce battle with the chain of Sullivan and Considine began. Their competition included such clandestine methods as stealing acts from each other and committing various forms of sabotage. This competition lasted for several decades and was one of the defining features of the vaudeville circuit of the times. Singers were very popular, and unlike the classically trained vocalist performing at the opera houses, they often sang new popular songs and could be accompanied by illustrated slides depicting the lyrics being acted out. Singing was also used by comic teams, coupled with dancing, or even incorporated into novelty acts, providing variety not just from other performers, but also within their own acts. Here's a typical summary of acts. Holmes and Dean make up a new team that will furnish the musical novelty act, promising to pull melody out of almost any old thing. The Schiller brothers, one a violin virtuoso and both sweet singers, are mere lads who have created something of a sensation on the vaudeville stage farther east on the circuit. The third musical team is styled the Jamesons, who sing and dance their way into favor on every stage where they appear. Those acts billed as musicians also differed significantly from the classical musicians appearing in opera houses, focusing on novelty tricks or unique instruments to entertain the audience. Memphis Kennedy brought a den of wild instruments to his performances. Lizzie Wells was a clever juvenile trick pianist, and Varden Perry Walzer were the novelty musical trio, the original ragtime players. Soubrettes, a subset of singers, were significant in that they served as a major fault line in differentiating between the high and low culture of vaudeville and the opera house. The term soubrette was traditionally applied to flirtatious or sexually suggestive stock characters in operas and musicals, but in vaudeville came to mean a singer who sang of sex boastfully or mockingly for comic effect. Olive Hare was billed as a dashing soubrette who is said to be charming both in appearance and voice. She sings catchy songs and does tween times dances. Soubrettes on the vaudeville stage represented a pull towards the lower culture, often associated with burlesque, but while sexually suggestive, were not as overt as burlesque performances. However, burlesque sensibilities did creep into the local vaudeville stage. In May 1905, an act called Mullane and Mullane billed themselves as burlesque sketch artists, although what this act contained is not described in the advertisement. Theaters regularly featured sketches, which often were simple one-act comic plays that could fit within the variety structure of a vaudeville bill. One description of a September 1904 bill notes that the variety offered in each sketch and ethnic characters that were often depicted. Quote, "The Randolphs are a comedy knockabout sketch team and precipitate rounds of applause and good nature in their sketch, Fun in a China Wash House. Fairburn and Keynes, a clever sketch team lately from England, will present their very funny travesty, An Irish Recruit, introducing straight shoe dancing and Irish clog, are to appear for the first time." End quote. Vaudeville theaters also offered other popular depictions of ethnic stereotypes, including German, Jewish, and Irish Americans, that were popular around the country. Vaudeville theaters also offered up Chinese and Japanese ethnic stereotypes. The opera houses had regularly offered performances of the popular Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, The Mikado, but vaudeville performances offered a differing depiction of Asian culture. The late 19th century was an era of increasing suspicion of immigrants and racial fears. During the early 20th century, the Chinese were the only ethnic group legally barred from entry to the United States under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and a 1907 Gentleman's Agreement between Japan and the United States blocked the immigration of unskilled Japanese workers. La Cola was billed as the American-Japanese juggler, while Durant and Baldwin promised music in Chinatown, including the song You Sabe Me? Descriptions that suggest they borrowed heavily from the minstrel show's traditional depiction of the other. Vaudeville also found some similarities with opera house productions that focused on the display of exotic peoples. Although nowhere nearly as popular as plays at the opera houses, blackface minstrel show performers were very common at vaudeville houses. Unlike the full-length minstrel shows that were performed at the opera houses, vaudevillians performed shorter sets, focusing on a specialized skill rather than the variety format common in longer performances. Performers were billed as blackface singers, blackface comedians, blackface female impersonators, and included Malcolm, a black-faced juggler and magician whose act came with the warning that, quote, ladies who wear diamonds had better don their paste set when they come to the Orpheum. For Malcolm considers it no trick at all to make a change of that kind when he sees the real thing, and he ought not to be tempted, end quote. Trump's daughter, Elizabeth, was born on April 30th. In May, when Trump applied in New York for a U.S. passport to travel with his wife and daughter, he listed his profession as hotel keeper. Due to Elizabeth Sr.'s extreme homesickness, the family returned to Germany later that year. In Germany, Trump deposited into a bank his life savings of 80,000 marks, equivalent to almost $1 million today. Soon after the family arrived in Germany, Bavarian authorities determined that Trump had emigrated from Germany to avoid his military service obligations, and he was classified as a draft dodger. On December 24, 1904, the Department of Interior announced an investigation to expel Trump from Germany. Officially, they found he had violated the resolution of the Royal Ministry of the Interior, number 9916, an 1886 law that punished emigration to North America to avoid military service with the loss of German citizenship. For several months, Trump petitioned the government to allow him to stay, but he was unsuccessful. An illiterate man who spoke broken English with a thick accent, Alexander Pantages, was ridiculed and bitterly fought against by Seattle's theatrical establishment. The works of Shakespeare had been divorced from everyday culture and sacralized, a process spurred by non-English speaking immigrants who had little connection to his work, and the decline of the romantic idealism embodied by Shakespeare during the 1880s. Pantages' inability to book great attractions forced him to branch out, opening theaters in Spokane, Davenport, and Denver. Pantages promised to marry Klondike Kate, but the love of her life and fellow vaudevillian, Pantages, jilted her in a particularly ugly way. While she was gone, he surprised her by secretly marrying another woman, a younger girl of higher social standing from the right side of the tracks. A musician, both an accomplished pianist and violinist from Oakland, California, named Lois Mendenhall. Kate was performing in her hometown of Spokane when a friend told her that Pantages had wed. She went into shock. Pantages told her about it by letter 4 days later. He jilted Kate, then 31, to wed 20-year-old Lois Mendenhall, a violinist in one of Kate's shows. Before Pantages met Kate, he'd apparently enjoyed no serious romance, and he had remained too driven by business schemes to spend much time womanizing. Nor had Kate given much heed to Lois, with whom she shared Billings in Texas, because the girl's act was based on genuine musical talent rather than looks and sensuality. Lois' prominent Oakland family could be an asset to Pantages. While Lois was a seasoned performer, her success does not depend on drinking with male customers after the show, and the innocence that attracted Pantages was genuine. He said, "It wasn't until I met Lois that I knew anything much about good women." And when first contacted by a Seattle Times reporter, he denied even knowing Klondike Kate. On October 16, Pantages started a family when his son Rodney Alexander Pantages was born. In 1905, hurt and embittered and heartbroken, Klondike Kate filed a breach of promise to marry lawsuit against Pantages in the amount of $25,000. Using hotel registers and love letters, she bared their torrid affair in the Seattle courts. Reporters sent her story around the nation. She claimed that on his promise of marriage, she had financed his enterprises, enabling him to rise from rags to riches in 5 years. Quote, "The woman declares that by her earnings as a vaudeville performer in the Klondike during the early strike, she enabled Pantages in 5 years to jump from poverty to riches, from a waiter in a dance hall in Dawson to the position of theater magnate," reported the Dawson Daily News in June 1905. Kate claimed she lavished $1,700 on Pages when he was out of work in Dawson, and that they had traveled across the country on her savings, returning to Seattle in 1902 to live as a married couple. She showed his net worth to be about $100,000, and she claimed that the plaintiff had injured, damaged, humiliated, and disgraced her, causing her to suffer anguish of mind. By 1905, film's growing popularity, thanks to new releases like The Great Train Robbery, one of the first movies with a clearly delineated story, led to a major explosion of audience interest in the medium. Films were coming into their own as a legitimate national entertainment, with the arrival of feature-length, i.e. 2 hours, films, and the movie palaces to see them. Going to the movies became a cultural phenomenon. Despite the elegant surroundings, a movie ticket price was comparable in costs to other forms of popular entertainment. For the industry to succeed, however, it needed stable, orderly production and clear methods of distribution. Despite Pantages' insistence that vaudeville and film share billing in his theaters, vaudeville acts were better organized as an industry than movies in the early 1900s. Thomas Edison, who placed his name on the projector despite it being patented by others, was a monopolist who regarded film less for its cultural attributes and more of its commercial exploitation. All those film exhibitors who bought his equipment, unless purchasing equipment illegally from overseas sources such as France and Russia, were also forced to buy the movies made at his Black Maria Studios in New Jersey. While Edison streamlined the assembly line of movie production and attracted talented vaudevillians, at least in the early years of the industry, for many artists, films were a sideline to their legitimate theater careers that generally paid higher salaries. Edison refused to identify the names of his talent for fear they would seek higher wages. Pantages began to build dozens more theaters, competing directly with every Sullivan and Considine house, eventually conquering the entire Pacific Northwest. He was known as a tireless operator and a particularly ruthless one. He enjoyed a high reputation for integrity in his business dealings that won the confidence of investors and creditors. His business practices with respect to his competitors reflected a far lower ethical standard. As a young man, Pantages was every bit as fierce in business as his chosen namesake, Alexander the Great, was on the field of battle. He stumbled and fell a few times, but with his business empire growing, he could forget his background or language barriers and concentrate on growing his business. This he did skillfully and with aplomb. In the bruising, cutthroat world of business, particularly the high competitive field of entertainment, Pantages stood on his own 2 feet, immigrant or not. It brought him into contact with those that wanted to steal his business, and he had to fight back with his wits and panache. When competing exhibitors brought in popular acts, he either snatched them under their noses or found comparable acts to compete with them directly. In one interesting episode, a famous violinist was due to play at a rival theater. Pantages sent a truck to pick up the violinist's Stradivarius, then called him on the phone at his hotel room and threatened to destroy the violin unless he switched to a Pantages theater. The man promptly did. In time, acts expected this behavior and worked for Pantages and his competition for the highest pay. Was this an example of the inner workings of the movie industry, or simply an expression of business competition? A different way of posing this question is to ask whether Pantages' behavior in the violinist case could have been repeated, for example, in the insurance industry or medical profession. That Pantages made such a threat and that it seemingly only heightened and embellished his competitive reputation and exhibition reveals the extent to which Hollywood was not an ordinary industry. Unique, perhaps in the entertainment field, the movie industry operated at once as a factory system, but one that relied heavily on public relations and publicity. It had to please its customers, yet also stand out in a leisure industry that ruthlessly fought for the attention, dollars, and time of its audiences. Standards of behavior of its practitioners did not always apply because Hollywood actors, for instance, lived in the rarefied world of fantasy and imagination. Actors, as the public face of the industry, endeared themselves to audiences in a manner matched by few other professions. They got under the skin as well as in their audiences' very dreams at night. This was a powerful and influential force, which further raised the hackles of conservatives in the culture wars, and why there were so many calls in the late 1910s and 20s to clean up the industry. For someone who likely grew up poor and without major social connections to assist him, save for his association with Klondike Kate, Pantages was truly the self-made type who enjoyed the perks of his success. He had a particular fondness for young, sexy, athletic female acts in his theaters. Not emphasized enough in discussions of Hollywood and its pioneering immigrants is the assimilatory role movies played in bringing the marginalized into mainstream society. If Pantages was an accidental theater mogul, so were many other immigrants who came to the industry, as it was one of the few occupations open to them. Film's seedy reputation discouraged mainstream investors participating in the industry, leaving the door wide open to a motley collection of cast-offs from other professions to make a go of movies. They worked hard and learned as they went along. As a businessman, Alexander Pantages' talents seemed very modern. His tireless pursuit of satisfying his customers, an obsession in some regard, could easily be recognized in today's digital marketplace, and certainly was one key to his success. Another was his haphazard career that toughened his outlook on life and fed his enormous competitive spirit to outfox more well-financed and well-connected theatrical operators. Certainly, his immigrant background significantly contributed to gaining access to movie exhibition at a time when non-immigrants regarded films as a degenerate art form. Had he remained on the Greek island of Andros or worked in Cairo, he would never have had the same opportunities to rise into mogulhood as he had in the United States. It is easy to assume that he was simply a product of a growing American economy and the success of one of the country's greatest inventions. But it is worth asking if the movie industry would have grown along the lines it did without foreigners like Pantages to push it along. The restaurant Trump and Levin started burned down in the White Horse Fire of 1905. Once again, in a situation that created many losers, Frederick Trump managed to emerge a winner. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake struck the coast of Northern California at 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, with an estimated moment magnitude of 7.8. As damaging as the earthquake and its aftershocks were, the fires that burned out of control afterward were even more destructive. It has been estimated that up to 90% of the total destruction was the result of the subsequent fires. Within 3 days, over 30 fires caused by ruptured gas mains destroyed approximately 25,000 buildings on 490 city blocks. Due to a widespread practice by insurers to indemnify San Francisco properties from fire, but not earthquake damage, most of the destruction in the city was blamed on the fires. Some property owners deliberately set fire to damaged properties in order to claim them on their insurance. Almost immediately, planning and reconstruction plans were hatched to quickly rebuild the city. Rebuilding funds were immediately tied up by the fact that virtually all the major banks had been sites of the conflagration, requiring a lengthy wait of 7 to 10 days before their fireproof vaults could cool sufficiently to be safely opened. The Bank of Italy had evacuated its funds and was able to provide liquidity in the immediate aftermath. Its president also immediately chartered and financed the sending of 2 ships to return with shiploads of lumber from Washington, Oregon mills, which provided the initial reconstruction materials and surge. In 1929, Bank of Italy was renamed and is now known as Bank of America. Kate demanded $25,000, but the case eventually settled out of court in April 1906, leaving Kate with a settlement of between $5,000 and $60,000 depending on the source. Elsewhere in the country, that was a respectable sum. However, in Dawson, one night's performance would have earned Kate $750. Despondent and weary, she accepted the settlement. Whatever it was, the settlement was not enough to stop the pain. Kate admitted, "For days I was despondent. Flossie de Atley, a girl who had danced with me in Dawson and had problems of her own with alcohol, domestic relations, and the law, wrote me a letter. She said, 'Don't throw your life away because of one man. Don't make yourself something he will always be glad he was rid of. Make yourself something he will wish he had kept.' The day I read her letter, I felt better." It would be more than 2 decades before Kate saw Pantages again. Briefly, Kate returned to Dawson, but for her, Dawson was a constant reminder of Pantages, and she was drinking heavily. Using her settlement money, she moved to the new Alaskan boomtown of Fairbanks, where at the suggestion of dance hall girl Edith Nee, She invested in a hotel. When the uninsured building burned in a fire that all but destroyed the city in 1906, Kate danced at the Floridor in Fairbanks to make ends meet. Pantages theaters had installed projectors and offered the ability to watch scenes from the San Francisco earthquake, as well as other silent films. Vaudeville theaters occasionally brought acting troupes to perform full-length plays, much like the opera houses. During the summer, the hot months when theaters traditionally lay empty due to difficulty attracting crowds willing to bear the heat, offering a play, the popular favorite, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Pantages opened the Lois Theater, named after his wife, which featured 1,200 seats and included stock theater, which was common at the time. Pantages offered year-round plays, but with films gradually gaining popularity, the concept failed. It was an important lesson for Pantages, who never ventured into entertainment territory outside of his comfort zone again. His business acumen and the growth of audiences brought him increasing success. His energies focused on the business affairs, and his personal relationships seem to have been rather distant. He had an extremely sensitive understanding of the psychology of his theatrical audiences, and he took great pains to keep continually in touch with the reactions of the patrons to his shows. He stressed, for example, the necessity of keeping performances relatively short and turning over audiences as often as possible in the course of a day's performances. In the debate over Sunday closures, he argued forcefully in favor of keeping theaters open on the grounds of the best interests of his largely working-class audience. Several double crossings by his partners led him to pursue a fiercely independent career. He said, "I have no partners except the wife and children. I want to direct everything myself. I want to decide everything myself. If I stop, I am lost. It is my way." Pantages theaters were elegant and efficiently operated. He showcased both film and live vaudeville to his audiences. He was a master of publicity and a grand mythologizer. Other fault lines of social division emerged within the vaudeville structure, most notably a distinction between big-time and small-time vaudeville theaters. Sophie Tucker succinctly recalled the difference between big and small-time in her memoir, noting, "2 shows a day instead of 3, top prices, $1.50, and every bill with 2 or 3, occasionally 4 headliners." Powerful circuits were forming in the Pacific Northwest, and American entrepreneurs John Considine, John Court, and Pantages soon acquired all the large music halls in British Columbia. Considine allied himself with an Easterner, Tim Sullivan, and 8 Northwest cities joined in the new transcontinental circuit: Portland, Seattle, Everett, Yakima, Bellingham, Vancouver, Victoria, and Spokane. Considine purchased the Savoy, remodeled it, and reopened as the New Grand, featuring continuous vaudeville aimed at a family audience. The Sullivan-Considine circuit was always in financial troubles, as its expansion revolved around mortgaging prior theaters to pay for new buildings or acquisitions, a risky proposition. As was the case with legitimate drama, circuit houses were a key factor to gaining a foothold in the emerging vaudeville business, both from the standpoint of performers and managers. Vaudeville acts existed as individual units. They coordinated their travel, shipping arrangements for their gear, lodging and meals, all of which came out of their own pocket. Guaranteed playing time on the circuit houses was therefore an essential element to a vaudevillian survival, particularly in the West, where the jump between cities was sometimes considerable. The situation was equally important to managers, however, who gained bargaining advantage on a long-term basis. Vaudeville was one of the most expensive forms of theatrical entertainment ever offered to the general public. The players of 7 different acts, each, so to speak, a star, and the musicians, stagehands, electricians, and management personnel necessary for the presentation of such acts were in the aggregate commanding an astounding weekly expense. In order to support such a crew, one essential was an assured audience, best obtained by moving from city to city throughout the country along a regularly assigned route. As the business developed, circuits became such a vital element of Western vaudeville that they multiplied much faster than their Eastern counterparts, the exact opposite of legitimate theater, where circuits were largely organized and controlled by Eastern syndicates. This is exactly where Seattle showmen such as Alexander Pantages and John Considine made their mark. All in all, the most important contribution of the Northwest to the national theatrical business was the origin and development of popular-priced vaudeville circuits. The stock companies and roadshows spread east to west. Vaudeville spread from west to east. In 1907, as Pantages rose up the economic ladder, so did his lifestyle. He built his family a well-appointed house in Seattle. It went on to become a city landmark, the Pantages House. In 2006, it was converted into a multiple family home for the homeless and those with AIDS. Pantages and Lois lived in luxury. On April 6, 1907, his second son, Lloyd Alexander Pantages, was born. In the early 1900s, most middle-class American entrepreneurs stayed away from movies because movies were considered lowbrow entertainment. This opened the door for immigrants like Pantages, and even women, to become involved in the industry, particularly in theatrical exhibition. Since many customers of movies were themselves immigrants, no language was required to enjoy watching silent films, it was a natural outgrowth. If movies had been born talking, they might not have been so enormously popular right away. Klondike Kate's hotel burned down, and she left Alaska for good in 1907, penniless again. She opened up a small storefront movie theater and store in British Columbia. A few months later, Pantages built the 650-seat Pantages Theater in Vancouver that stood until 2011. He created office acts. This was an act, usually a dancing flash or full-stage comedy turn drawing a good salary, which the Pantages office owned. But Alexander Pantages knew what he was doing, and he would play the bookings offices against each other, with Chicago keeping a check on New York, Los Angeles, while keeping them all in line. Trump's family lived at 539 East 177th Street. Their second son, John, was born. Later that year, the family moved to Woodhaven, Queens. While living in Queens, Trump opened a barber shop at 60 Wall Street in Manhattan. In 1908, there were 8,000 movie theaters in the country. Pantages opened the Pantages Theater in Victoria at 570 Johnson. Trump bought real estate on Jamaica Avenue in Woodhaven. 2 years later, he moved his family into the building on the land, renting out several rooms. He also worked as a hotel manager at the Medallion Hotel on 6th Avenue and 23rd Street. Trump intended to continue buying more land, but during World War I, he kept a low profile because of anti-German feelings in the U.S. due to the war. German-born citizens came under suspicion. During periods of war and anti-German discrimination, Fred Trump denied his German heritage, claiming his father had been a Swede from Karlstad. Pantages had amassed a considerable personal fortune in 1909. He owned mansions in Seattle and Los Angeles and managed or owned theaters up and down the Pacific Coast and beyond, in Canada as well as in the United States. The majority of the theaters were owned by others and managed by Pantages. At home, the tiny, shy Carmen tended goal, albeit reluctantly, for her hockey-playing brothers in the ballroom of their mansion in Seattle's Washington Park. In 1910, vaudeville had 2,000 small-time theaters spread across the United States, with larger theaters, such as the Palace Theater in New York, making profits of $10,000 a week. Pantages opened his first downtown Los Angeles theater for his vaudeville film house circuit, the building that later became known as the Arcade Theater. It was managed by Carl J. Walker. Pantages also owned an office building next to the theater at 411 West 7th. The businesses in the Pantages building included a surgeon, dentist, tailor, property manager, and theatrical exchange. His daughter Carmen Elrene Pantages was born this year. It was not just the knack of attuning himself to his customers' tastes that brought Pantages astounding success. He was also a business visionary. Much of his success was undoubtedly due to his ethic of hard work. There was also an element of luck involved. The country was industrializing, and with the increasing spread of factories across the nation's landscape came a more regulated work week. Calls for 10 or 8-hour workdays brought into focus increased leisure time, something not always available to farmers who have irregular hours. Industrialization also was a magnet for immigration, which between 1880 and 1925 brought over 22.5 million foreigners into the country. In 1910, 14.7% of the population was foreign-born, the highest percentage in the country's history. These immigrants primarily settled in urban areas, and it was here that both vaudeville and eventually film received a strong reception. Even African Americans, who had been depicted since the minstrel era as unfit, quasi-savages, and were generally unwelcome in first-class vaudeville theaters, began to challenge the popular biases against them on stage. By the 1900s, black and tan establishments that catered to an audience of black men and white women constituted the low end of vaudeville and offered an opening for talented African American performers such as Burt Williams and George Walker. By the 1910s, Williams had become one of the most famous entertainers in America and challenged popular perception since, in the words of critic Edith Isaacs, somehow or other laughing at Burt Williams came to be tied up in people's minds with liberalism, charity, and the 13th Amendment. Vaudeville emerged as the dominant urban entertainment of early 20th century America by embracing middle-class social values that new members of the urban working class were encouraged to adopt. Trump and his family returned to New York on June 30th after the German government determined that he had originally left Germany in 1885 to avoid taxes in the army. Their son Fred was born on October 11th in the Bronx. Pantages had put a considerable dent in Kate's fortune, so she took her vaudeville show on tour, performing in saloons and theaters up and down the coast. Then she went on the circuit in the States, doing song and dance numbers with a performer named Arthur Searles, and later with a rolling skating champion named Jimmy Ray, whom she may have married. She struggled for the rest of her life to make ends meet. Touring took a toll on her, however, and after an emotional collapse, she retired from the stage. Pantages had gone on to build a huge empire of vaudeville theaters all over the West with his name on them, and every time Kate passed one of them, it hurt. The only thing that made it feel better was performing, and she toured and performed frenetically for a few years, trying to lose herself in her work. Finally, after an especially bad ankle sprain brought on a sort of nervous breakdown, a doctor told her bluntly that she'd have to quit or she'd die. Nearly broke and in need of a new career, she traded her house in Seattle for a homestead claim of 320 acres near Brothers, Oregon, in the sagebrush plains between Bend and Burns. Kate enjoyed the life of a local celebrity, supporting a variety of charitable causes but focusing much of her attention on the volunteer fire department. She acquired the affectionate nickname Aunt Kate, but rumors